You are listening to An Interview With, a podcast from filmmakingreview.com with me, Catherine Tosko. An interview with Charles Shaw, director of Exile, The Plastic People. So tell us about Charles Shaw, the speaker and documentary maker, and how you came to be who you are today.
Oh, wow. That's a really...
How many hours have I got?
Yeah, I was going to say 20 minutes probably won't cover it. If you'll permit me a minute of like shameless self-promotion, I'll say that my book, Exile, Drugs, Prisons, Politics, and Spirituality, covers most of that story. And it's what kind of brought me into the social justice realm. And, you know, basically it was in reaction to a lot of things in my formative years, including a pretty crippling addiction early on in my life. And then my experience with the criminal justice system, that really kind of turned me on to, you know, dealing with many broad social justice issues. But I tend to like gravitate towards defending the kind of disenfranchised groups and subgroups and masses and such, people affected by the drug war and things like that. And it was in my work doing an oral history on the drug war that I came across, stumbled really across this idea of mass deportation of immigrants from the United States. And then by proxy, I've understood that this is a worldwide phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. And this film is about what you call the plastic people, isn't it, on the border of America?
Yeah, this was one of those beautiful divine intervention stories that just kind of fell into my lap. I wasn't looking for this story, but I was looking for something about the Mexican drug war. You know, I started investigating this kind of angle during 2010 and 11, kind of at the height of the violence that was going on in Mexico. And I had a friend that was living in Tijuana. There's actually a group of friends that live down there because there is a burgeoning Ibogaine community down there.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, Ibogaine's not legal in the United States, but you can practice with it in Mexico. So there's a lot of, you know, addiction specialists and clinics and such down there. One of the people connected to this community was the person who turned me on to the story. His name's Chris Bava, and he's also a photographer, and his photos are featured in this. But we were kind of looking for a Mexican drug war story, and he just kind of started to tell me about all of these, you know, essentially Americans that he was meeting in Tijuana that were homeless, that were in the streets, that were destitute, and that had been deported from the country.
Why do you think that America in particular has such strong laws around borders? I mean, it just seems from, say, a European point of view, where our borders are all open and we travel very freely around a big mass of land. Why do you think that America has got so paranoid, basically?
Well, it's an interesting question. And I would say that the paranoia is actually global. I think that there's particular paranoias in the United States that are, you know, egregious in their own nature. And, you know, our fear of brown people is one of them. And, you know, if you notice, we don't have a similar border along Canada. We just have one along Mexico. And so, I mean, you know, one of the things that I hope to try to communicate in the film is that however you want to see it as a problem, reaction, or solution, Mexico became one of the kind of like largest victims of the post 9/11 era and of all of the laws and cultural shifts that happened after 9/11. Mexico really suffered the most.
Why do you think that is? Perhaps because we've got an international audience, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think the simplest way to put it is that there was a global economic system that was imposed after the Cold War ended, By the 1999 in Seattle and such, we understood that this economic system was very, very problematic, and it was causing pretty big unrest, and it was looking to continue to cause this kind of unrest. And part of that was all of this, dislocation because of globalization. People being turned off their lands, migrating to large urban centers, looking for work. Tijuana is one of the prime examples of that. It became a huge metropolis because of NAFTA and because of the northward migration of Mexicans, to looking for work.
Yes.
And so what ends up happening is that during the Clinton era, there's this massive free flow of Mexicans coming into the country because of NAFTA. And, the Mexican-American population swells to over 30 million, and the illegal population is estimated at like about 12 million.
Wow.
This is a huge economic and political force. And they, just kept coming because conditions in Mexico deteriorated and conditions in the United States were significantly better. So they had to find a way to stop this, and 9/11 was the perfect pretext. It was the perfect, excuse to now draw all of these, new borders, build new border walls, enhance border security, and crack down on, illegal immigration by connecting it to crime and connecting it to terrorism and all of this other stuff. So later when the Mexican drug war came in, that was just really to kind of like continue to demonize Mexicans and immigrants and to continue to justify greater and greater expenses spent to build larger border walls and to, arm people and have border checkpoints, which now extend 100 miles inland from the border now.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was a whole cultural shift that happened around this idea of America's economy shifting. I think it's pretty safe to say that the people in charge understood that the American economy was going to drastically change, that our standard of living was going to drop, that other rising economies around the world were going to take a larger share that we used to hold. I mean, it's all pretty basic economics, but, in between is the human stories and what's happened and the victims of all of that. And this mass migration of cheap immigrant labor is, the first to go.
And so you talk a lot about surplus population in some of your talks that I was watching last night at Burning Man. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about this idea of drugs and surplus populations, which seems to be one of the themes in this documentary.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is also something that I've gone into pretty extensively in my first film, which is the Exile Nation Project, the oral history of the war on drugs. And I've written about it a lot as well because it's a significant, kind of obvious hiding in plain sight explanation for a lot of what's going on. This has been kind of pigeonholed as a Marxist analysis, but it really isn't. It's just kind of pretty empirical and macro if you take a look at it. But what it basically states is that, when an economy expands, it brings in labor, and it usually tries to bring in the cheapest labor, and that's historically been, either slaves or, second-class citizens or immigrants, and often they're the same. But when an economy shrinks, when an economy shifts, often there's many that are left behind in that transition. So when the United States went from a, kind of a productive industrial economy to a kind of information service-based economy, so much of that that was based in the urban centers labor force became unnecessary because those jobs are now being done in Mexico and Japan and Korea and Taiwan and so on and so on. So when you have that population that is no longer necessary and no longer employable, there aren't enough jobs for them, then what they become, as far as social planners see, is surplus population. They're essentially consumers that have nothing to produce. They have no purpose. They're just there, like mouths to feed. And they become what is viewed as an intractable population that requires this kind of permanent management. so they kind of treat them like children,
Yeah.
and it's all about kind of like trying to as effectively as they can restrict and punish and manage and identify as many of them as possible. So this whole prison industrial complex arose partially as a way of containing this underclass that had nothing to do and had no gainful work or prospects in life and who were kind of angry, but also because there's this, this phenomenon called the replacement economy.
Hmm.
This happens all the time when the kind of general economy, the productive economy, leaves or is offshored or collapses or what have you, and a black market economy comes in.
Yeah.
And it's almost always a vice economy. So it almost always involves drugs and
Yeah.
alcohol, sex. And then there's a companion economy that grows up to fight this new, scourge of vice that comes in. So it's like half the population goes into vice, and the other half goes into the fight against the vice.
Hmm.
And they usually can divide that among racial lines, so it's easy to kind of keep the camps together.
Yeah, if you could explain that a little bit more, because that's a really interesting concept to me.
Okay, well, the simplest way to put it is that in most of the states around the nation here in the U.S., the African Americans are concentrated primarily in the urban centers.
Yeah.
And the prisons are located in the kind of far-flung rural areas,
Yeah.
very far from the population centers.
Yeah.
And so, for example, in the state that I was incarcerated in Illinois, which is basically driven out of Chicago, which is the kind of great metropolis at the center of the country. There's 10 million people that live in Chicago. There's, 2 point some million black folks that live there as the kind of majority. And they all get sent to these 28 odd prisons that are all around the rural areas of the state that used to be farming communities.
Yeah.
And in the cities, you'd have industry, and out in the rural areas, you'd have farming. And those are the two twin engines of the economy that used to power the Midwest. And they both kind of disappeared. Big agro bought up all the family farms, and the industrial economy went to Asia and to South America and such. So in comes the state and the federal government saying, okay, well, your town is dying here, but what we'll do is we'll build a prison here, and we'll give you all of this money to upgrade your infrastructure and your roads and your sewers, and we'll give you these tax breaks and yada, yada, yada. So throughout the 80s and 90s and most of the first part of the Bush era, prisons were booming all over as a kind of another replacement economy to keep money flowing through the community.
So when you were in prison, what was your experience of prison and the people that you were with? I know it's a kind of cliche. People say everyone says they're innocent, but truly, what were people in prison for? And do you think that a lot of them shouldn't have been in prison?
Well, there's many classifications when you get into the prison system based upon the crime that you committed. But if I'm speaking in broad terms, and this is definitely my experience as well, but around 60% or so of all drug conviction, of all incarcerations are drug related.
Yeah.
And they're all basically somehow drug connected. And that was my experience, definitely. I was in a minimum security prison that primarily dealt with drug offenders, low-level offenders. And then it was also a transition facility for people who had been in the system for many years. And they had been in maximum security settings and needed to kind of get socialized again before they were released out into the world. So this is the closest thing that could come to socializing them, was to put them in a minimum security prison where we were actually free to interact with each other.
Right, okay. So when you're in that situation, when you made your documentary, you've met a lot of people that have been in these situations, haven't you, who have been kind of institutionalized by being deported. So what kind of people did you meet? Could you tell us maybe about a couple of the people that are in your film?
Yes, well, this is where the issues connect as well, in that, most of the people that I met that had been deported to Mexico had some kind of interaction with the criminal justice system, and most of them was because of drug problems. Mm-hmm. So, say you've got, you're a drug user and you get busted in the States. The issue that I focus on my film is not just about this issue of illegal immigration, you know, whatever you want to call that. A lot of people, they have one image, and I'll answer your question by kind of setting it up and saying that, like, the image in the mind of most Americans is that there are these, you know, brown people that sneak across the border to take jobs that are otherwise meant for Americans. They steal from us. They steal our resources. They take free health care and all these things that they think we have in this country, which we actually don't. And then, you know, they pay nothing, they contribute nothing, and they have no allegiance or loyalty to the United States. Well, this is true of a certain amount of migrant workers that are usually, you know, in the western part of the United States and in the southern part, particularly in California, that are involved in the farm economy. And yes, there's a lot of migrant workers that come here, they work. They're brought here actually to work illegally. They send all their money back to Mexico, and that's what the government really has a problem with, because there's none of that money circulating here. So when they're deported, you know, everybody feels justified. But what I'm talking about and what my film focuses on are people who emigrated to the United States years before with their families. People that grew up in the United States from the time they were very young, 2, 3, 4 years old, that lived there for 15, 20 years, but now in this post 9/11 kind of immigrant paranoia era are being rounded up and deported by the millions. And I mean that literally, by the millions. And so even if your parents live in the United States, or if you're a U.S. citizen and your parents aren't documented yet, but you've lived here for 20 years, it doesn't matter. There's no process or judge or any way for you to plead your case. If you are now arrested for any reason or stopped by a police officer, you're instantly cross-checked with a database, and if you're not a citizen, you're deported. It's that simple. So many of these people have drug problems. So many of these people, that's how they get caught up in the criminal justice system or get arrested or get stopped. And then they end up in Tijuana and they have nothing. They're disavowed by the American government. They're disavowed by the Mexican government. And they're like Palestinians or boat people. You know, they're nationless people now. They're trapped at the border and they have nowhere to go. And not only are they trapped at the border, but they're trapped in the most dangerous ghetto on the border called Zona Norte, which is essentially a cartel retail zone. And their life expectancy is very, very, very short.
And did you feel safe when you were there? I mean, did you?
No.
No.
Not at all.
What did you see when you were there that made you feel so in a dangerous position?
Well, you have to understand, you know, Zona Norte is this ghetto that's on the border, and it abuts this kind of cement river that is in between the United States and Mexico. And that river is the sewer of TJ, Tijuana. Now, that's where most of these deportees live because there's nowhere else for them to live. They live in the river, in the sewer drains. And it's pretty harrowing. And then in the streets is, you know, this area where all of the drug cartels, you know, work out of. And so it's constantly, you know, subject to violence between the cartels and on also the police, who work hand in hand with the cartels in Mexico, by the way. They're there, and the attitude of the Mexican government and the Mexican police towards these people is that they're not Mexicans and that they're, you know, useless drug addicts, which in Mexico they don't believe that addiction is a disease. They don't believe it can be cured, so they basically just see them as parasites.
So when you were filming, you must have been thinking about now when you're how are you going to raise awareness with this documentary? So really, what are you hoping to achieve with the documentary? Who do you want to communicate this issue to, and how do you want to set about that with your campaign on Indiegogo?
Well, the campaign on Indiegogo is really geared towards getting us our finishing funds. You know, we were blessed to have foundation grant fund most of the production of this over the last couple of years. And this is the Tedworth Charitable Trust, which is a branch of the Sainsbury Foundation based out of the UK. And they've been very good to me and my projects over the last 4 years. Through that foundation and through the kind of fiscal sponsor, which is the Open Democracy Group, a publication based out of London that I serve as an editor for, we're kind of hoping to use this as the basis of a human rights campaign. And whatever money we can make from this, and the film industry is in a really interesting place now historically, so there's not a lot of money to be made, in films, particularly those of a political social justice nature. But if we can make any money, what we would like to do is to set up an organization and or work with a couple of organizations we feature in the film, to try to create a kind of not only like an awareness that this is happening, of course, because this is a consequence of not only our drug policy, but also our immigration policy. Mm-hmm. And we have a president now just starting his second term who deported more immigrants in his first term than George Bush did in two, which is a little frightening. Yes, it's a little frightening. But there's 30 million Mexican Americans, and this is an issue that is touching billions of lives as far as migration is concerned. But there really is nothing for these people once they cross the border. They're literally stripped of everything that they have, all of their possessions, identification, and everything, and they're just spit across the border. So we want to create a cushion, a pillow for them to land on when they cross. There's 400 a day that are dumped into Tijuana. I mean, it's a staggering number.
Yeah.
And we need some way for them to be registered so that their families know that they're there, so that they know there's not really resources available, but at least they know where to go and what they can do, mm-hmm. and start some kind of process of getting them identification so that they can work and they can provide a living for themselves.
Sure. So if people want to get involved with your campaign, I'm going to put the link up for your campaign, but if you could just briefly, before I let you go, tell us about the different things that you've got on offer, the prizes, rewards that you get on Indiegogo for your money.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I've been involved in a lot of Kickstarter and Indiegogo campaigns, and a lot of them give a lot of like perks, and very few of them ever deliver on them because they often don't factor them into the money they're raising. So,
yeah, sure.
With that thing, we also believe in this new media, this new model of filmmaking. So people who contribute to our finishing campaign will be listed as, crowdfunding producers, specifically set aside from everyone else. We're also, for larger contributions, we've got, co-producing and executive producing slots that are available to people who want to give larger contributions. We're also giving away, signed movie posters from all the producers, and some of the photography that's featured in there by Chris Bava, who I should mention, he's a key figure in the film. It's actually kind of his crusade to help these deportees, and he and his wife and his brother were killed in a car crash last October before the film was completed.
Right.
And so this is also kind of like, this film is really to honor his legacy and his work, for posterity.
It's become more poignant since then.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay, well, what I will do is put everything up for our readers underneath your podcast so that we can get you to where you need to be. So you're looking for $10,000, is that right, on your Indiegogo?
11.
11, okay. Well, we want to make it more than that anyway, so we'll see what we can do.